Hi, my name is Tom Shadyac, and welcome to Minds of Mountain Film. I have the privilege of sitting with Ken Burns today, almost inarguably our most prolific documentary filmmaker, and he has a new film coming out about the national parks. It's a 300-part series?
300 parts,
No, it's
yeah.
a 6-part series,
12 hours.
which I've seen one of, and it was amazing. It was incredibly spiritual, and I want to start with that. What motivated you to want to do this? Because you talked about the idea of separation, how we as a culture have become separate from our natural surrounding, and how that moved you.
Well, I think the first thing we have to understand is that the United States was a Garden of Eden, which everybody found to be this pristine alternative to what civilization had done to Europe. And we just assumed that this Garden of Eden would be around for a long time. And the other, and it of course wasn't, and we started using it up, and we needed to set aside places. The other thing is that we always focus on our political liberties and not the religious freedoms, that we can worship God the way we want to, however we want to in the United States. And it's only a short distance after that you'll get a transcendentalist like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau who'll say that you can worship God, you can find God better in a cathedral built by nature, in nature, than you can in a cathedral built by man. And the Hudson River School comes along, the Rocky Mountain School of Painting comes along with these rapturous biblical scenes of nature. And then it's the next step is saying, you know what, we need to save this. We need to go against the acquisitive and extractive interests that are us all the time. Make a quick buck just for now and save these places. So the story we're telling is rooted entirely in the spirituality of place, of the land, of these amazing early Americans who said we need to go swim upstream from the current of what we normally do and set aside places.
And the irony is, I think that we get saved in the process.
That's exactly right. We
know?
get completely saved.
Yeah, I mean, I love Emerson. I've been such an Emerson guy.
He said, he invented a word. He said, do whatever inly rejoices in his essay on self-reliance. And that's the key.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean just self-interest. It's enlightened self-interest. That you do whatever you do that doesn't hurt anyone else. And all of a sudden you see the parks, as Wallace Stegner said, the best idea we've ever had. So we call our film, The National Parks, America's Best Idea.
Yeah, I was influenced by Thomas Merton, who was the first sort of Catholic to open up to all faiths.
Right.
And he said that nothing has ever been said about God that hasn't already been said better by the wind in the pine trees.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, that's what I heard in your movie, the wind in the pine trees again.
And this is, John Muir is this son of a Calvinist who beat him until he memorized the Bible, and then all of a sudden could shed, as Emerson said, the knapsack of civilization. The knapsack of care falls off the back, and in nature, something else is possible. Muir said, in order to go in, I have to go out. That is to say, in order to know myself. And it doesn't matter how you understand it. If it's spiritual, that's fine. If it's religious, that's fine. If it's Socratic, that's fine too. If it's scientific, all the better. But in order to find out what's going on, inside me, I have to go out into these pristine environments and experience a kind of silence and a kind of quiet that we don't get anywhere else.
You must have a hope with this film. Is there a hope that you carry with you? That your film would affect people?
Well, it's not a substitute for going into it, but I also know that Franklin Roosevelt, who was a paraplegic and approved Kings Canyon in California, did so only because he'd seen the photographs of Ansel Adams. So it is possible to take some of whatever that thing is and see it through the medium of a painting or a photograph, and that's possible, or hopefully a film. But what I really want people to do is go and see the national parks. We used to be arguing in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s about being loved to death. That's no longer the problem. In our virtual universe right now, attendance is declining, and if attendance declines, there's no constituency. If there's no constituency, then the Cheneys of the world can build the power plants next to it and harm the fragile environments. You can take your guns in, you can bring in as many snowmobiles you want, and all of a sudden somebody will say, let's put another Hetch Hetchy Dam. Let's change this. Let's make this smaller rather than larger. So after the Civil War series came out, a few years later, I was walking across the lawn at the Visitors Center at Gettysburg. Superintendent reaches down and picks up a popsicle wrapper and waves it in my face and said, it's all your fault. Because his attendance had gone up 200, 300%. I want every superintendent mad at me.
May we
because that's a
blame, yes.
good problem to have in a democracy.
May we blame a lot more on you.
I hope everybody's struggling, that those traffic jams get worse, and then we figure out, well, maybe we put a monorail at Yellowstone, or maybe we do as we do in Zion, which we make you park in one place and then a bus, an emissions-free bus takes you all around. We can figure this out. The only thing we can figure out is what to do if nobody goes.
Now, is your larger hope that people will reconnect with this idea of the natural world and our
Absolutely.
dependence and interdependence on that world?
Yeah, I think we realize that all of the people that we get to know in this film have some transcendent experience in which they're awakened. They're made to feel about an ever-present now that most of us have only fleeting glimpses of in our lives, and they stay with us as talismans for the rest of our life. That one moment with that one mentor, that one moment of real silence and quiet that really rearranged our molecules, and then the rest of the world came in. But that's okay. Yes. People like Muir had that all the time, and were able to articulate it in ways that I think by going out there, we put ourselves in a position to have these kinds of transformative moments. And that makes for better human beings. It makes for better citizens of whatever country it is, particularly ours. It makes for better families, it makes for better individuals, and it makes for a better humanity when we grapple with a lot of things that are now on the brink.
Tell me why you think it makes a better citizen. You know, the mystics always said you had to be full, you have to first empty yourself, and nature's a way of doing that. But why do you think the return to nature, the return to this connection, will help us as a species, a country, a world?
Well, let's take a country first, because this was an American idea. We can take justifiable pride that for the first time in human history, land was set aside not for kings or noblemen or the very rich, the way it had always been, but for everybody and for all time. It was a democratic impulse. It could have only come out of a people that had at least paid lip service to the idea that all men are created equal. And our country's been slowly expanding what that means. Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote it, meant all white men of property free of debt. We now mean a lot more, not enough. So too, the national parks have sort of grown along with that. And they first started off as these spiritual places to get away, to find yourself. But then also they became, as the first director of the Park Service says, vast schoolrooms of Americanism. When we sing "My Country 'Tis of Thee," we don't mean industrial statistics or even metropolitan skyscrapers. We mean the land. We are drawn back inexorably to the land because it reminds us of an essential archetypal us. When we human beings, regardless of whether we're citizens of this country or not, feel that, have a relationship to all things, a kinship that John Muir insisted we needed to have, not just with fellow human beings, which is good to begin with, but with all things, the rocks, which he said he would stop and ask a rock where it had been and where it was going. We're talking about no time. Then this makes us citizens of the planet. We feel ourselves bound by laws that don't have to do with how big my bank account is, what I'm going to get from this person, whether that person likes me or not. We're bound by higher laws, and that's what it's all about. Our religions falsely give us the sense that God is sitting there sort of watching everything all the time. It's our obligation to swim upstream against the current towards the light, and then maybe get noticed by God, by her.
Can I say an amen, brother?
Amen, brother.
Oh my goodness, if I had a choir, they'd be singing in the background. Mary Oliver's my favorite poet. She's a contemporary poet, and she sees virtue in a stone.
Yes.
Virtue in a polished stone. So, all right, let me ask you kind of a little twisty approach here. The Ken Burns effect has been talked about, but I want to talk about what things have affected Ken Burns. You are our greatest historian, again, almost inarguably, in terms of film, documentary film. You have studied the lives of so many people, so many of our cultural trends, from music and our sports. What do you know? I want to ask you how it's affected you.
I was interviewed about 12 or 15 years ago by two sociologists that were writing a book on the early death of parents. My mother died when I was 11. And after 2 hours of interviewing me and talking about the difficulties and all the stuff that are both unique and universal to that sort of tragedy, she said, "What was your mother's greatest gift?" And without hesitating, I said, "Dying." And then I started to cry, because I realized that in some ways all that I am, all that I have been, all that I imagine I will be, came from that tragedy. And that, as horrible as it was, as much as it has burdened me with sadnesses that are indescribable, it's also made me who I am. And many, many, many years after my mother's death, I realized that I had never been able to be present at the anniversary of her death, April 28th. It was always a day that was approaching, and it was always a day that was receding. And I told this to a friend. He said, that's a child's magical thinking. You're keeping your mother alive. I bet you blew out the birthday candles after she died, wishing she'd come alive. And I said, yeah, how'd you know? He said, this is magical thinking. So I went to a psychologist who was a friend of mine, and I said, I seem to be keeping my mother alive. He said, what do you think you do for a living? I said, excuse me? He said, you wake the dead. You make Abraham Lincoln and Jackie Robinson and Louis Armstrong and John Muir come alive. Who do you think you're really trying to wake up? And then you realize that whatever animates us from the outside, whatever sort of work we have, Robert Penn Warren admonished me never to use the word career, whatever professional life we adopt, there's always some much more complicated psychological underpinning that is at the heart of why we choose to do what we do. And the mindfulness of that gives us some sort of impetus to continue, or some sort of way to see beyond whatever narrow things brought you there. So what affected me, to make it really short, is my mother died when I was 11 years old. But you know, what I do keeps the wolf from the door. And what I do is history, and it isn't just excavating dry dates and facts and events. It's an emotional archaeology that is straining to listen to the ghosts and echoes of an almost, I think, inexpressibly wise past.
Well, I just had the privilege of interviewing Howard Zinn also, and Howard says it's essential to look back in order to know how to move forward.
Yes.
So you have been able to look back. How do you think we're moving forward, and are you hopeful about the way we're moving forward? We're sitting in the middle of an economic crisis, which is an opportunity.
Yes, it is. Well, let me not qualify, but add to what Howard said, because he's absolutely right. The past is gone. We're never going to get it back. But history is the set of questions we in the present ask of the past. So it's informed, however consciously or unconsciously, by what we want, what we fear, what we're anxious about. So when I was a kid, the centennial of the Civil War happened in 1961, and it was sort of about buckle collectors. It was about regiments and armaments. It didn't have the emotional archaeology that later people would invest, and that I hope that I was able to invest in a story of the Civil War, 30 years after that, in 1990. So it's where you are. I've done a film on the national parks, and the next episode I'm going to show here is on the Depression. Well, the national parks thrived during the Depression. They got the first stimulus dollars, the first shovel-ready stimulus dollars of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that not only put men to work, young men who would have been a burden to their families, and built the trails that we now walk on, but brought a kind of dignity of having a job, brought money to the communities, and brought Americans together. So, the Chinese don't have a character for a crisis. They combine two, threat, which is obvious, and opportunity. So I think right now, the way we engage history is the idea that we learn from conflicts of the past, and we try to translate or transform these crises into the essential element of opportunity and figure out how we might then be able to redirect the energies now. Because if we live in a journalistic moment, if we just scream at each other on cable TV, all you are doing is perpetuating the dialectic. And we're already too dialectically preoccupied. Everything's male, female, black, white, yes, no, up, down, hip, not, east, west, north, south, and we forget to select for some mitigating wisdom that sees all. What Howard's saying is that having a historical perspective allows you to know not only where you've been, but where you are and where you're going. And then you make choices that are informed less by the passions of political, small p, political argument, which are nothing. They're and about something that has more substance to it, that's informed by something that takes in a much larger picture. And that's why history is the best teacher that I know.
Are we learning? Do you see us learning?
you know, people talk about cycles of history, and I don't believe that. It's just human nature is always the same. So what is required is that for some of us to insist that we not be the same, to outgrow or to shed what is the basic human nature. That in a Darwinian universe, which it definitely is, we know scientifically, we are obligated spiritually and intellectually to grow, which is what we tend not to do. People, I made 2 films on wars, and people say, you know, wouldn't it be great if human beings didn't have wars anymore? Not going to happen. Where there's always going to be wars, because human beings naturally go into defensive postures and then into aggressive actions just in a one-to-one situation. So it's how you train a cadre of people, beginning with yourself, to begin to shed the mechanisms, the triggers that permit that. History is a guide. Being present in the moment, as a John Muir would suggest, would be a guide, and then trying to apply that mindfulness to the future actions. And it's really, really hard. You know, we drive up here in fossil fuel burning automobiles. We wear sneakers made in Indonesia by people paid so little money. We speak the right language, we talk the talk, but it's so difficult to walk the walk. And we submit ourselves to organizations that sort of commit cultural hegemony throughout the planet, and yet we are not yet free of their tyrannies. So it becomes the obligation of each person to sort of understand the prison. Lincoln said it best: the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves. That means not be slaves. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we can save our country. That's all it is. We just need to disenthrall ourselves.
What I see in your work is what I would like to see more of in the world, which is, I don't think as we look at history, as you said, you know, you ask questions based on where you are. And Howard asked questions about the people who lost, quote unquote, in history. And you ask these other questions. You mentioned Darwin, for example. I don't think people get the information that Darwin mentioned love 95 times.
Of course.
He mentioned survival of the fittest twice.
Exactly. Love is essential to a Darwinian equation. Love is the ingredient that makes the universe more. You know, I mean, just take a biography of Lincoln. He's always much better than he actually is, right? Well, the real Lincoln's here. The difference between how we see him and how he actually was is our wish for ourselves. That's why we engage in history, so that we can teach ourselves lessons of how we'd like to be. And that the ultimate thing is this equation that only love multiplies. That's the only multiplier. Only love multiplies. And you know, whoa, Darwin, no, it's this. It's love. That's, I mean, he got it. He knew what the ingredient was.
Is that a driving force behind your work?
Every film. It's always about love. How could it not be? Everybody's here. That's why they're here. That's why he's holding the camera. You know, I mean, what you know, we get off base. We forget, but that's the thing we want. We can reduce some stuff to money, sex, and power, and those become sort of operating principles for most people most of the time. But what we actually hope that those ingredients combine to do, which they never can, is create the other substance of the universe, which is found in strange places, like the way you look at a mountain and wish there was a word for the feeling that you had for it, and the way you feel if you have children, where it's unconditional, the way it is as we struggle with another person to experience that.
Man, I'm feeling a little of that love right now.
Good, absolutely.
Let me before I get weepy, let me ask you one more question. You've probably been asked this question, but let me try it anyway. Who makes the documentary about you, and what does it look like?
You know, it's not necessary, because I think that my job, you know, do you remember, like, after Barack...
I was going for the job, by the way.
Yeah, well, after Barack was elected on a Tuesday, right? Then we didn't see him, and everybody was bereft. He was there every day during the election. Then he shows up on 60 Minutes, and Steve Kroft says, so now you've inherited all these problems. Do you ever think, yikes, what have I gotten into? And he said, no, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. You know? And I felt that all my life. I feel so privileged that I wanted to be Howard Hawks, I wanted to be Alfred Hitchcock, I wanted to be John Ford, and I went to Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and all my film teachers were social documentary still photographers. And they went, and reminded me quite correctly how much more drama there is in what was than in anything the human imagination dreams of. That you could have in a single image complex information that you could allow to live, and that I suddenly combine this, I guess, with this desire to wake the dead, wherever that comes from, and almost instantly applied that social documentary mentality to history, and suddenly realized all the bells went off. You know, it was like some jackpot at Las Vegas. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. So I don't actually need anybody to write that. You just want the things to live. You want them to have a life. They're like your children. You get, as John Muir said, a practical sort of immortality by the relationship to nature. I have 3 daughters and I have 23 films, you know, and I have a relationship of love with them, and that's all that's needed. You know, the gravestone should say "Good Father." You know, that's it.
Well, this has been a privilege. We've probably gone over our time. I want to end by saying that you've told me that you wake the dead, you know, in history. I also think you wake the dead, all of us, because you wake us up. You know, a lot of us are asleep, I think, about what's happened, what's happening, and we're asleep in our lives, and that's what the spiritual journey is a journey of waking up.
It is.
And I really feel...
That's a very nice thing to say. I think that our process is all about realizing how lucky we are in the process to be reminded, in the best sense of that word. That's what it is, to find a moment where we are reminded, where we can bring to the present some mindfulness that doesn't have a past, that doesn't have a future. I don't have to be anywhere but here, and to stay, and I think that that's what a purpose of art is. That's what the purpose of science is. That's what the purpose of religion, spirituality. All of those things are trying to impose a kind of structure to the chaos, the random chaos of stuff. We'd go mad if we really perceived it, but we get the scenario of our own lives and our own jobs. We're awakened by art. All of it keeps the wolf from the door.
Fantastic.
Hurrah.
Hurrah. Thank you. Thank you, Ken.
My pleasure.
Great.